would say a fireplace is a great gift because you have a place to put the fire. But if you said, you know what, I'm not going to give you a fireplace, I'm just going to come to your house and set a fire, we would say that's not a gift. You say, sure it is. It's the gift of fire.
Please join us as Pastor Steve Brower continues our study in the book of Numbers. We'll be in Numbers chapter 34 in the sermon titled, The Lines Have Fallen. In this passage, we find the second and third of 5 final speeches from God to Moses and the people of Israel here at the end of this book. It contains the boundaries of the land of Canaan given to Israel as well as a listing of the tribal chiefs. We apologize for the poor sound quality at the beginning of this recording. We are experiencing some audio difficulties, but it does get better, so stay with us.
Numbers chapter 34, we're going to be considering the second and the third final statements that God makes to Moses, who is still with us, to Joshua, to Eleazar, to the children of Israel, just as they are at the entrance to the land of Canaan. So Numbers 34, we see this powerful passage that ultimately talks about the boundaries of the land and also sets up chiefs in Israel in order to distribute the land accordingly. And as we approach chapter 34, I think what we discover as we do this is we take a step back and we ask the question, when did this all begin? And, kind of where are we from a standpoint of God's larger purposes with the promises of the land of Israel? And if we go all the way back to Genesis chapter 12, God had spoken to Abram and he had called him out and he had told him that I will give your offspring this land. Genesis 13, God had brought him to the land. In fact, he had Abraham walk the length and the breadth of the land, and the boundaries that we're going to discover in chapter 34 were already present in the mind of God. They were already there. Abraham had already walked them to a certain degree, and God helped Abraham in Genesis 13 to visualize everything that he had in mind. In Genesis 15, he made a covenant with Abraham to give him the land. In Exodus chapter 3, he had reestablished that. He had told him, I am bringing your descendants to this land. In Numbers chapter 13, they had approached the land from the south, and at Kadesh Barnea, you remember the story, as the spies went over into the land, and the message there was, go look at the land that I am giving you. And now in Numbers 33, the message is, go and possess the land I have for you. In Numbers 34, here are the boundaries of the land that I am giving. So what we're talking about is roughly 600 years, a narrative arc, from Abraham all the way to Numbers chapter number 34. 600 years till we get to this generation that ultimately is going to enter the land and conquest the land. And what we are seeing here in Numbers 34 is centuries of a divine promise becoming concrete. You can imagine what that must look like. They were the generation. And really the center of this passage fits perfectly into the last third of Numbers, because the focus is on the realization of possessing the land as a gift from God himself, a gift from Yahweh. And so as we approach this passage, we say, okay, there's a bunch of boundaries, there's a bunch of names, what do we draw from this? And I would humbly submit to you that we can confidently receive what God gives because God wisely determines our inheritance. And so we're going to walk through this passage, and we're going to see how this inheritance that God gives to us is ultimately something that gives us confidence in the character of God himself. We start out by recognizing that God defines our inheritance. This is chapter 34, verse number 1 through 12. He is going to set up the boundaries that are there for the children of Israel in the land of Canaan. And it really ought to speak to us that simple truth that we ought to trust God's boundaries. Look at Numbers 34, verse 1 and 2. The Lord spake to Moses, saying, command the people of Israel, say to them, when you enter the land of Canaan, this is the land that shall fall to you for an inheritance, the land of Canaan, as defined by its borders. So, of course, we're talking about borders. We have to look at a map. And as we look at this map, you can see the land all the way from down here. Here's Kadesh Barnea. And specifically, we see some of the names that are listed as we read this chapter, the desert of Zin, and it all is all the way to the north. And so these are actually the boundaries that are listed out that we find. There's the Jordan River, of course. This is the Sea of Galilee, and this is the land of Canaan. You'll notice these two lines. This is the route that was traveled by the 12 scouts. And so when we come to this passage, we're immediately reminded of Numbers chapter 13, because a lot of the place names, a lot of the things that are pointed out would be very familiar and would draw the attention right back to when the scouts went into the land and ultimately determined not to trust God. Now they are again at that point where they have the opportunity to trust God. And it drives us back to that point. Trust God's boundaries. Because we all recognize that God has the right to establish the boundaries. One of the first things that ought to capture our attention is that Israel does not draw the boundaries themselves. They enter into the promised land, and many times when you are a conquering nation and you come in, and then you determine, here's the boundaries, right? When you win, you set the boundaries. But here, it's a little bit reversed. God says, you haven't even entered the land. I'm going to tell you what the boundaries are. This part is yours, and this part is not. And here's where you need to draw the line. It's easy for us to love God's generosity, but if we're honest, we sometimes struggle with his boundaries. Is that a fair statement? Boundaries are a part of God's goodness. A gift doesn't cease to be good because it has boundaries. In fact, I agree that too much of a good thing often becomes a bad thing. But that's something that we all experience in our life. Part of what makes a good gift good is that there are boundaries. Now, we all live in Minnesota. We all appreciate a good fireplace in the land of 9 months of winter, right? Now, notice that I didn't say a good fire is a great gift. A fireplace is a great gift. Because simply having a fire is not necessarily a great gift. It would be nonsensical to us because we see the wisdom of having the boundaries for a fire. We would say a fireplace is a great gift because you have a place to put the fire. But if you said, you know what, I'm not going to give you a fireplace, I'm just going to come to your house and set a fire, we would say that's not a gift. You say, sure it is. It's the gift of fire. And you can do with it what you want. And we would say, no, that is not a gift. Now, suppose somebody would say, but because I really love you, I've removed all the boundaries. No fireplace, no chimney, no hearth. I'll just give you the fire. And we'd say, well, that's not as good a gift as a fireplace. The boundaries actually make it a wonderful gift. The very things that restrict the fire are part of what makes the fire a blessing. Remove the boundaries, and the blessing becomes destructive. Have you ever experienced something in your life where God has said, here's what I'm giving you, here's the boundaries, and in your mind you thought, I'm going to go against those boundaries. I'm not going to take him at his word. I'm going to fight against those boundaries. And it became a destructive force in your life. We have this strange idea that if God is good, he should give us good things without boundaries. Don't we have that idea? It's like God shouldn't give us any boundaries. If he really loves us, he would give us all these things without boundaries. And then we come to a passage like this where God is making it very clear to the children of Israel, here is a good gift that I'm giving you, but here are the boundaries for it. And he sets it up in a very intentional way, and it actually magnifies the gift. It demonstrates his character. And so we see God giving Israel the great gift of the land of Israel. And one of the things that makes it such a great gift is that it has boundaries. Marriage is good, and God gives it boundaries. Sexuality is good, and God gives it boundaries. Work is good, and God gives it boundaries. Rest is good, and God gives it boundaries. Food is good. Amen. I got it. I was going to see which amen when it would come out. Food is good, and God gives it boundaries. Money is good, and God gives it boundaries. Authority is good, and God gives it boundaries. And we can go on, right? We can go on. We think about all these good gifts that God gives, and they have boundaries. And it really drives us to this question. The crux of the issue is this: do I trust the giver? The one who not just gives the gift, but also sets up the boundaries. It's the difference between contentment and covetousness. Contentment requires trusting the giver. Covetousness begins when I stop thanking God for the portion that He has given me, and I begin concentrating on the portion that He gave someone else. And when I begin to shift that, I end up coveting that which is not mine. Psalm 16, verse 5 and 6, "The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance." Hey, these are the boundaries that God set up for the children of Israel, and it's very easy for us to understand how crucial this is. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Are you content with the lines which God has given you? You know, it really does drive home that question of, do I trust the giver? The reason God commands us in the 10th command not to covet is because we are so often tempted to covet. It is so easy to covet that which God has given to others. Their family, their abilities, their finances, their opportunities, their ministry, their buildings, their health, their career, their possession. And what it reveals is our heart. Our heart sometimes of ungratefulness, our heart sometimes of discontent, our heart sometimes of unbelief. Can I trust God with my portion without constantly looking over the fence? That's ultimately one of the challenges that was going to be there for the children of Israel as well. God defines our inheritance. God also remembers our inheritance. This is chapter 34, verse number 13 through 15. If we could put it this way, trust God's promises. God remembers our inheritance. We ought to trust His promises. Look at verse number 13 through 15. Moses commanded the people of Israel, saying, "This is the land that you shall inherit by lot, which the Lord has commanded to give to the 9 tribes and to the half-tribe. For the tribe of the people of Reuben by father's house, and the tribe of the people of Gad by their father's houses have received their inheritance. Also, the half-tribe of Manasseh. The 2 tribes and the half-tribe have received their inheritance beyond the Jordan, east of Jericho, towards the sunrise." And so the 2.5 tribes had already received what God had given them. But the other ones, God was saying, "This is the land you shall inherit by lot." We see from this God's individual promises. One of the details we should learn from our study in Numbers is that God is intensely personal. He is not making sweeping promises that apply to a majority, but are not nuanced enough to be personal. That's not the God that we have. No one actually falls through the cracks with our God. No one is too small or too insignificant to be remembered. He is a personal God. Rather than Him being a God who is so big that He cannot be bothered with every detail, our God is so big that He is personally involved in every detail. And when we consider that, we have to ask the question, do I believe that about me? Does God actually care about me? And I would suggest it's on display for us in this passage. God was concerned with the Moseses and the Joshuas, with the Aarons and the Eleazars, but He was also concerned with every individual Israelite. Each tribe received their own portion. Even the 2 tribes and the half-tribe beyond the Jordan. It was intensely individual, and so it is with us. His promises are individual. They are also certain. We can pay attention to the language. This is the land that you shall inherit, is what he says in verse 13. This is the land that you shall inherit by lot. When he promised to Abraham that he would have the land 600 years ago, he was bringing it to fulfillment right then. 2,000 years have passed since Jesus rose from the dead and ascended to the Father, and we still await his return. But remember, God is not dragging his feet. He is fulfilling his promise. He is accomplishing all his purposes, and he will keep his promise. Jesus told the disciples, I go to prepare a place for you. And that place is still future. Paul wrote that we are heirs with God, fellow heirs with Christ. And you say, where's my inheritance? Where's my inheritance? Well, the fullness of it is still future. But it is no less real because we haven't seen it. And the direct fulfillment of his promise to Israel that we see played out for us here in Numbers 34 ought to build confidence within us. Faith treats God's promised future as a present reality. That's what faith does, right? I was talking with Micah and Savannah. Savannah's due date is today, right? And so you can pray for them. I don't know if they're here right now. I suspect they are not. They might. Oh, they are. They are here. Where are they? Where's Mike and Savannah? They aren't going to raise their hand now. There we go. Yeah, Savannah's like, why did you call me out? Sorry. Due date today. We can put ourselves into their situation. They're expecting a child, and so they have prepared for a child. Is that a true statement? We've prepared for the child. They have a crib or a bassinet. They have clothes in a dresser someplace. They have diapers in a closet. Maybe they even have the child's name in various places, right? Someone could walk into a room designated for their baby and say, this is strange, there's no child here. True, but everything in the room points towards someone who is coming. The parents are arranging their present life around a future reality, and that is faith in action. Israel hasn't entered Canaan. God is telling them its boundaries. He's naming the men who would distribute the boundaries. And in our day and age, we live with that same tension. Peter says that we have been born again to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, unfading, kept in heaven for you. That's a wonderful, wonderful faith promise. We don't see it yet. But unseen does not mean uncertain, right? It is a certain reality. We ought to live as citizens of a different kingdom, even though we've never seen it. That's the life of faith. God defines our inheritance. He remembers our inheritance, and he prepares our inheritance. This is verses 16 through 29. Here we need to trust the providence of God. Look at verse number 16. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, these are the names of the men who shall divide the land to you for inheritance. Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun. You shall take one chief from every tribe to divide the land for inheritance. And then it lists all of the names. Why give us all of these names? And the answer is because God isn't merely promising an inheritance abstractly. He has already made provision for how his promise will actually be administered. He has made it clear this is how it will happen. God prepares before we arrive. God has thought through the details. Israel standing on the plains of Moab. They haven't crossed the Jordan. Jericho is still standing. It has not yet fallen. The Canaanites have not been defeated. Yet God is already saying, here are the boundaries. Here's how it's divided. Here are the men who will ultimately divide it. And this is an amazing truth. He has done the same for us. Reminds you of that old saying, I've read the end of the book and we win. It's an amazing feature of our God. He actually doesn't leave us in the dark, right?
He points out what will happen, and he has given us the end of the matter. He does that again and again and again. Now, sometimes we like to take God to task because we don't know the exact next, we don't see the whole road. And we go, well, God, you're not revealing enough. But it really is not the truth. That what he has revealed to us is not just the next step, the next right thing, but he has also told us the end of the matter. And it's an amazing thing that our God does. He doesn't have to do that, but he has done it. The challenge for us is to simply believe. Believe and obey. God prepares before we arrive. God uses people to accomplish his purposes. We're given these names. There's a reminder that God uses people to accomplish his purposes. One of the intentional literary elements of this chapter is an allusion to the other chieftains in Numbers. The mention of, as I had pointed out, the desert of Zin in the south and Lebo Hamath in the north. It recalls the route of the scouts in Numbers chapter 13, verse 21. It specifically identifies that. They were given the names of, then, after that, were given the names of 10 men, including Caleb. Men who did trust God and were rewarded for their trust and obedience. So we had the 10 bad spies, and now we're given 10 good chieftains. And all of that in the context of the first 10 representing the first generation, and the second 10 representing the second generation. And the question is, what's the difference? And the answer is not, Israel was stronger, because the census reveals that that's not the case. The answer is not that God was stronger, because it's the same God at the beginning as it is at the end. The answer is simply, the 10 chieftains believed. They trusted. And they were rewarded for their trust and obedience. And we know that that's the case because we have an overlap. Isn't God amazing? Because the overlap is found in Caleb and Joshua, who are part of that 12 and also part of the 10 in a unique way. And so it's truly amazing to see how the whole book of Numbers starts there, ends here, and yet throughout it all, it reveals the faithfulness of God throughout the whole thing. And we realize the maybe difficult truth that God does not actually need you. Is that shocking? God is fully capable of accomplishing his purposes without you and I. And you say, well, he has to use somebody. And I said, God will use somebody. We place, I think, too much emphasis and confidence in our own abilities when we think that God needs us, that God is dependent upon men to accomplish his purposes. That the reason that good is not defeating wrong more soundly is because there are not enough men and women committed to God. And I would say, well, on some level that's true, but the reality is that God is completely in control, and he is not dependent upon people in any meaningful manner. In other words, he determines to use people. What God does do is that he determines to take people and use them in amazing ways. And friends, this is the greatest joy of a Christian, is the realization that God, out of his grace, has determined to put me and you in a place where we can be a part of what he is doing. And we get to join into that. And that is such a tremendous blessing. It has always been the case. We see it on display here. God simply says, these are the men who will obey me. And because of that, he blesses them. It ought to encourage us. It wasn't dependent on that. But he did bless them because they followed him in obedience. You and I are also the men and women whom God has a plan to use. You say, what if I don't want to be used by God? And I would say, then you get that choice. But why would you do that? Because God desires to use you to further his purposes. He uses people to accomplish his purpose. But God also rewards patient faith. Boy, it does your heart good to see Caleb and Joshua again, doesn't it? When we see Caleb brought up again. Caleb waited 40 years, but God had not forgotten. In Joshua, we discover, in the book of Joshua, we discover that Caleb was 40 years old when Moses sent him to spy out the land. 40 years. 40 years old. He wandered then for 40 years in the wilderness. Now we look at the dates, and it's roughly a year or two already elapsed. And so Caleb would have been 78, maybe 79 when Israel crossed the Jordan. Okay, so here's Caleb. He was there with the first scouts. They're there at the mouth of at the edge of the Jordan. He's hearing all of this from God, and he is 78, 79 years old. Isn't that kind of mind-numbing? And now he crosses Jordan into the land. Joshua chapter 14, verse 10 says that Caleb was 85 years old when he receives Hebron. And so they have the major conquests of the land. It's roughly 6 or 7 years, I know, but it really is 6 or 7. What can you do? And so that's the time frame that it was as he enters into the land of Canaan. And so Caleb waited approximately 45 years, believing God's promise and personally receiving his inheritance. And during those decades, the promise hadn't become less certain because Caleb had grown older waiting for it. God rewards patient faith. And maybe you look at your life and you say, I'm waiting to see God answer some specific prayers. And I would say, God rewards patient faith. Continue to be patient and faithful to our God. He defines our inheritance. He remembers our inheritance. He prepares our inheritance. What do we do with this? Let me just give you 4 quick points of application. 4 points of application. First of all, receive your portion with gratitude rather than comparison. You know, when we compare, essentially we're saying, God, I think you drew the lines incorrectly. The answer to covetousness isn't merely to stop wanting what someone else has. It's learning to trust the wisdom of the one who assigned your portion. And friends, we need God's help for that. Receive your portion with gratitude rather than comparison. Secondly, don't confuse a boundary with a lack of goodness. If we could ask yourself the question, where am I presently resenting a boundary God has established? God established it, and I'm resenting it. You say, well, maybe that isn't true in my life. And I'd say, maybe it's not. But just ask yourself that question. Is there a boundary that God has set up that I am currently resenting? Remind yourself, not every limitation in our lives is God's permanent assignment. Faith begins by trusting the character of the one who drew the lines. Thirdly, live today in light of what God has promised tomorrow. Faith arranges present life around a promised future. Why should I pursue holiness now? Because I'm going to see Christ. Why should I sacrifice now? Because this life isn't my inheritance. Why should I give of my time, my resources, my ability? Because my treasure isn't ultimately here. Why endure? Why suffer faithfully now? Because suffering doesn't get the final word. Why keep serving when it seems fruitless? Because God has promised that our labor in the Lord is not what? In vain. Why can I face death differently than others? Because death isn't my loss of inheritance. Death is one final obstacle between me and the fullness that God has. Live today in light of what God has promised tomorrow. Finally, don't measure God's faithfulness by his timetable. Don't measure God's faithfulness by his timetable. Think of Caleb. At 40, he believed God. Then he waited. He watched an entire generation die. He grew older, but he did not lose hope. He believed. The passage of time did not weaken the promises of God. Don't measure God's faithfulness by God's timetable. Trust his boundaries. He's wise. Trust his promises. He's faithful. Trust his providence. He's already preparing what he has promised.